Hello everyone, thanks for coming onto the channel. To start with, I would just like to give praise and glory to God for the fact that my family and I have power again. Our power actually came back on last Wednesday, although we were without power for nearly 9 days due to a major storm that came through the area that we live in. Unfortunately, there are still a few thousand people currently without power, but Lord willing, their power gets turned back on soon as well. I would just ask that you guys keep those people in your prayers. So with that said, let's go ahead and get into today's topic. So is it in fact the case that personal experience counts as evidence? Now, in all honesty, I think it is the case that personal experience counts as evidence. However, I would have to admit that as far as I can tell, personal experience primarily, if not exclusively, counts as evidence for or to the person who has actually had the personal experience. The reason for this, of course, is self-evident, which is that no one can access anybody's personal experience except for the person who has had the experience, right? Like I might have some kind of personal experience, but it's an internal experience that only I have access to. Someone outside of me does not have access to that experience. Now, maybe I, give a testimony of that experience to someone and they find it compelling or convincing for whatever reason. But at the end of the day, the only person who can access that experience is me, is the person who had the experience. Like that's just how it works. This, of course, is something that's very important to keep in mind when it comes to having worldview discussions. Because obviously there's a lot of people in the world, whether we're talking about Christians or Muslims or Jehovah's Witnesses, that claim, right, to have had some kind of personal experience that relates to the faith that they hold to, that they believe in. But at the same time, it is evidently the case that these various faiths or religions, worldviews, contradict each other, right, in numerous ways. I think Christianity and Islam are a prime example of that. Now, obviously, there's similarities between Islam and Christianity. There's definitely common ground, but there's a lot of dissimilarities as well, right? And those dissimilarities make it the case that the two religions or worldviews cannot be reconciled, right? Like they can't both be true. One of them has to be false. Now, it could also be the case that they're both false, right? But they can't both be true. So, and that's obviously very important to keep in mind when it comes to having worldview discussions with people, because a lot of times people will point to their own personal experience. The issue with that, though, is the person that you're having the discussion with can't access your personal experience. So if you truly want to have a discussion about your worldview versus their worldview and which one is correct, you're going to have to point to something outside of your personal experience. And this is the point that I really want to drive home, because obviously genuine personal experience certainly counts as evidence. The question, though, is how do we determine, who has had a genuine personal experience and who hasn't? Because obviously, obviously we know it's the case that there's, thousands of different people in the world that all claim to have had some kind of personal experience in relation to a particular worldview. And at the same time, we know that there's other worldviews that contradict that worldview, right? And they all contradict each other. So obviously we have to realize and conclude that it can't be the case that all these people have had genuine personal experiences. And what I mean by that is personal experiences that actually correspond to reality, to objective reality. So the approach that I like to take when I engage people in apologetics on the street, whether I'm talking to a Muslim, a Jehovah's Witness, a Sikh, doesn't matter. I always try to ask them, okay, so you claim that you've had this particular experience that relates to your worldview or religion. Okay, but what can you point to outside of your experience that would validate it or support it in any kind of way? Because obviously I can't access your personal experience, just like you can't access my personal experience. So, what evidence or any kind of indicator can you point to that actually supports or corroborates your personal experience in some way? Now, I will admit that if someone can't point to any kind of evidence that supports or corroborates their personal experience in some way, that doesn't necessarily mean that their experience isn't genuine. However, if someone believes in a God who has created the world and interacts with the world, sustains the world, and so forth, they should expect to be able to find some kind of evidence or indicator that their personal experience regarding that God actually does comport or correspond to the external world that they find themselves in. So the whole key to this type of approach, which is an approach that I've used myself on a number of occasions, is to examine a particular worldview, right? Say, okay, this is the worldview that you espouse to. Let's take a look at it in relation to the reality that we find ourselves in, right? And then let's take a look at my worldview in relation to the same reality that we find ourselves in. And let's just see which one makes more sense within that particular context. Which one is actually supported by the evidence. So, of course, the point here is if someone's worldview doesn't comport with reality, or if at the very least it doesn't seem to comport with reality, then they should probably consider not holding to that particular worldview. So, once again, personal experience is a valid form of evidence, but when two or more people claim to have a different experience of the one and same reality that we all share, that's when you have to point to something outside of the personal experiences in order to determine which experience actually corresponds to the reality that we all share. That's the only way that works. Well, guys, that's it for this video. So as always, please let me know what you think, and remember to like, share, and subscribe. And I'll catch you next time. Thank you very much.